Are we live now? There will be a question and answer period at the end, so we'll get to your questions. But I'm going to start with the past of the animal rights movement and move forward. A lot of people feel that the animal rights movement grew out of the environmental movement, but that's actually not accurate. The animal rights movement preceded the environmental movement by about 100 years. It grew out of the abolitionist movement in the early 19th century, and one of the early guiding voices in the abolitionist movement, William Wilberforce, was also the founder of the RSPCA in 1824. So these two were linked, and it was felt they had a common mission. And moving forward in our country to the Civil War, right after the Civil War, a lot of organizations began having as their purpose the protection of animals and children. Animals and children. And what happened there, it's very odd, is that the children's protection movement continued to grow. There were child labor laws passed, there were prohibitions on children's labor, there was mandatory schooling, there was social agencies, all these things happened in the field of child protection. But what happened in the field of animal protection? After about 30 years, it stopped. There were animal cruelty laws passed in the 1870s, 80s, and 90s in all states, and that was it. Now, why did one protection movement keep going while the other one died? It's because animals are property. That is the legal basis of their exploitation. And that's what we as attorneys have been fighting ever since. Animals are property. So going ahead now to about 1975, there was a new feeling in the air. The 60s and 70s were a time of great turmoil. All the isms were being challenged: colonialism, sexism, racism. And it occurred to a few of us that there was another one, and that was speciesism. We had to invent the word for it. But this was something that we felt was not being addressed anyplace else. So we decided that, okay, we think that animals are not ours to wear, eat, or experiment upon. What issue should we work on? So I'll give you an example of the kind of things we worked on in the 80s and the 90s. We worked on companion animal issues. Spay and neuter became the main thing. Now you have spay and neuter bans, low-cost surgeries. We worked on the animal cruelty laws during that period. The cruelty laws that were generally misdemeanors became felonies in all 50 states. So that was accomplished during the 80s and 90s. Other things we did in other areas. The field of animals in entertainment. Circuses, zoos, rodeos. They all became subjects of intense criticism. A lot of roadside zoos were shut down on cruelty grounds. Circuses, well, it began to be circuses, they didn't have animals. And in terms of rodeos, a lot of things happened there too. There was now a requirement in most states that a vet be present at rodeos. And the most egregious acts in rodeos, such as the tripping of animals, was banned in most states. So you have movement on all these animals and entertainment things. And another area we did was product testing and medical testing, experimentation on animals. And I have to say that PETA was right in the front of this. PETA was the group that brought to our attention what happens in the labs. And the first case where this occurred was called the Silver Spring Monkeys case. Silver Spring Monkey. And that was in 1981 when Alex Pacheco, one of the founders of PETA, got into the labs, took pictures of monkeys being tortured, and made them public. This resulted in the first police raid on a lab on cruelty grounds in the history of the United States. And in terms of product testing, that was just as bad. The tests in those days, there were two main tests. There was the Dre's test and there was the LD50 test. The Dre's test involved be dripping into the eyes of small animals, usually rabbits, toxic substances such as Drano. You can imagine Drano being poured into your eyes. And they wanted to see what happened. Of course, the rabbits went blind in that eye under terrible torture. Peter made this public also. There was another kind of test called the LD50 test. LD stands for lethal dose. So lethal dose 50 meant that the amount of toxic substances fed to the animals, this is the feeding, this is not the eye one, the amount of toxic substances fed to the animals that would kill 50% of the control group. And we publicized the heck out of this, and they're still legal, unfortunately. Dre's test, the LD50 tests are still legal, but very, very seldom used. And this was the result of intense publicity. Another area we worked in was wildlife. We had a new tool, the Endangered Species Act. So what were we going to do with it? We had to get the species listed. So the Interior Department, which was the first department that administered this, we had to get the species listed. So we got them listed. And now we had to get the enforcement. So we really worked on the enforcement aspect of the ESA. The ESA is our greatest tool, it's our greatest friend. Other things that happened during that period in terms of wildlife was that we publicized what happens to animals in fur farms. And we had pictures of animals being anally electrocuted so as not to damage the fur. We had pictures of animals biting off their own legs in steel-jawed traps to get away. Nobody knew what a steel-jawed trap was. Nobody knew about what happened in fur farms. This was all the result of undercover videos. So we did that too. I'm giving you a summary of what happened in the 80s and 90s. The last thing we did, and this is the hardest, was the animals in factories farms. We are not winning that issue. We are not winning that issue. There are more and more vegans. I mean, look at this hall. People here, there are more and more vegans, but guess what? There's more and more animals being killed every year. In slaughterhouses, more and more animals in factory farms. So how can these two things go together? How can we be having all these vegans and yet the situation is worse? It's because of the increase in human population. You flowchart it back to that, that's the problem. And everything we do in terms of veganism, or in terms of restrictions on pollution, in terms of carbon credits, is going to be swallowed up by human overpopulation. So that's the bad news. And the answer to this is that there has to be a worldwide movement to empower women, to have fewer children if they so desire, or to have no children if they so desire. That is at the heart of the overpopulation problem. And that's the one we have to work on, and that's the one when Janet and I go to conferences, world human overpopulation is barely mentioned because it's a toxic subject. Nobody wants to address it. How many people either on the Republican side or the Democratic side are going to mention one word about it? And that's why I'm bringing it up. So these are some of the issues we worked about in the 80s and 90s. Now I guess this is a time for me to mention what I did during that period. My background is criminal law. So I was the attorney who defended the animal rights activists that got arrested in the 80s and 90s. And there were a lot of interesting cases, but I'll just give you one. There was a hunt planned for a park adjacent to San Francisco Bay. And the night before, the police had blocked it all off, and they put up all these concrete barriers to keep the activists from going in there. And in the morning, when the hunters came through and they had all their licenses checked, they came through and there were 20 activists behind them. They had come over across the bay. They slept there. And as the hunt began, they would rise up like ghosts out of the bushes and blow these horns and scare the animals. I don't think one animal was killed that day. But those are the kind of people I like to defend. It was an honor to defend them. Other things I did is I defended the people that were called before federal grand juries. There were a lot of witch hunts in those days, and they needed somebody that knew that area of law, and I was happy to do it. So that's my participation. Now moving on to the present. A lot of things have changed. The main thing I see that has changed is the assumption that humans are a superior species, when there is so much evidence to the contrary. Take this case of the gorilla and the little boy. The gorilla was shot, as you all know. But a lot of people felt the gorilla hadn't been shot. What if there had been 5 gorillas? Shoot them all. What if there had been 20 gorillas standing around the little boy? Shoot them all. This discussion is on the table now. And it wasn't 30 years ago. It's no longer assumed that human interest will always triumph over non-human animal interests. And that used to be the assumption. So given that fact, we wanted to move forward and build upon that. So I'm going now to 2000 to the present. Several things have changed. The first thing that has changed is that there's less of conflict between people who are talking about animal rights and animal welfare. That used to be a big subject. Your animal rights, your animal welfare, and arguments. That is less the case now than it was then. You'll hear the term animal protection law. And animal protection indicates that we have now realized that there is a continuum. And anything along the continuum, do it. And stop arguing over these terms. So that is less an issue than it used to be. Another thing that's less of an issue is the conflicts that used to exist between the animal rights movement and the environmental movement. This used to be not very easy because I represented people who were vested in both, and there was not a unity of interest. And now the environmental movement has realized that it's not just about numbers, it's sustainability. You can have sustainable populations, but what about the individual animals? These are individual animals with families and feelings. And there's a lot more veganism in the environmental movement. Some of the first environmentalists were big meat eaters and hunters. And that's all changed. And on the animal rights side, it's changed too. Because there was a realization that if we don't act for clean air and clean water, we're all going to die. We're all going to die. Not just the animals, not just all of us. So there's a lot of feeling that we have to put our energy behind things that aren't specifically animal related, such as the antibiotics issue. There's huge cooperation between the environmentalists and the animal rights people on the antibiotics issue. So talking about current trends, there's a lot going on in education that there wasn't there. All those stupid charts about the 4 food groups, they're gone. And people realize the benefits of veganism. It's in the schools. Thank God, it's in the schools. And the educational piece, especially in farm animals, Mercy for Animals has been wonderful. I want to extend a hand to them. They've been fabulous in letting people know that what goes on in factory farms is not what you see. It's not Charlotte's Web. They're not the animals running around in the green fields anymore. And you'll see that when you go into the market. In these butter containers, you see this happy cow walking around. No. So the education is there. That piece is in place. And what about the law? We have laws now we never had before. We have the felony laws in all 50 states. We have, I'll talk about the CITES. I don't know if any of you have ever heard of CITES, CITES, but I'll talk about it. It's the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species. And it's worth knowing about. It's supposed to do internationally what the ESA was going to do nationally. But CITES has been a big disappointment. They do the same thing as the ESA. They list species, they prohibit the trade of the animals themselves or parts thereof. But the problem with CITES is that it was left to the individual countries to enforce. and enforcement is nil in some countries. Look what's happening to the elephants. There's all these laws against elephant poaching and selling of ivory. Some countries are not enforcing sightings, and that's what's the problem. This is a work in progress. Other things in the legal field, there's been a lot of successes here. And I have to say that Animal Legal Defense Fund, who I work with very closely, they've been in the forefront of this. What they're doing is they help the prosecutors have successful prosecutions for people. They're very good at that. They bring attorneys together so that you don't have to reinvent the wheel every time you write a brief. They put you in touch with experts in your area that you can call for your cases. It's been wonderful. Other things that are happening is in the legislative field. There's a lot going on in the legislative field. There's, first of all, animal-friendly caucuses. In Washington, for example, there's an animal-friendly caucus. There's one here in Denver called the Paw Caucus. And they meet while the legislators in session. If you ever are interested in actually talking to the legislators, asking them questions, saying why they vote for something and why they don't, come to Claw Caucus. And you can just Google that under the word Claw Caucus. And this ties back into education. Because I can tell you from experience that if you talk to the legislators, they're going to want to know, is this something that the people are aware of? You've got to show when you go into the legislative offices and talk to the legislators or the aides, there's a movement behind this. There's 10,000 people writing letters. It's in the papers, it's on the internet, it's everywhere. Because otherwise you're not going to get any traction at all. So the education is essential to the legislative piece. And last of all, but not least certainly, is what is going on with a humane economy. All these years we've been arguing morals, that it is wrong what you're doing. It is wrong. And of course it is. But in the last few years, we've been able to argue that it's good for your corporation, it's good for your PR, it's good for your bottom line to go humane. And examples of this are ecotourism, big business now. And a lot of countries have been approached in Africa saying, hey, you've got to keep these elephants. You'll make a lot more money from ecotourism. And you go from having these animals killed. And they're going, oh. And the same thing is happening with places like PetSmart and Petco. They don't sell puppies anymore. What they do is they make their facilities available for adoptions from local SPCAs. And by doing so, they get the great PR to get people to come into their stores and buy all their accoutrements. It's a win-win. And there's a lot of those going on. And when I come to this part, I have to mention HSUS and Wayne Pacelli. Wayne has written a brilliant book called The Humane Economy. And it lays out numerous instances of how companies can be persuaded to be more humane. Not necessarily because they have big hearts, but it's going to help their bottom line. Another example is after the lion was killed, Cecil Lion, several airlines refused to carry animal parts anymore from trophy hunts. Qantas and Air France among them. I'm not sure they were doing it out of golden hearts, but they weren't losing any money by that, and it was good PR for them. And if you approach them and say, look, it's going to help you and not hurt you, then you have a situation where people get on board with you, and it's not as oppositional as it was in the 80s and 90s. And that's the new trend. And again, HSUS has been great on this. I want to leave time for questions and answers, so I'll just say this. We've had a lot of successes. Condors are coming back, eagles are coming back, mountain lions are coming back. Wolves, that's a work in progress. But we've had a lot of successes, and we have the feeling throughout our country and throughout the world that animals have some rights. And if we can get one animal to have rights, in this country we'll have broken the wall of property. And that's what the non-human rights project is. You may or may not have heard of it. That's Steve Weiss. And Steve, by the way, is coming to Denver, DU in the fall. Go see him, he's good. And what the non-human rights project is, it's a desire to show how similar in DNA, how similar in behavior, how similar in feelings primates are to us. So there'll probably be one primate that's granted status of personhood, which is the legal definition of you have rights. And if you have that, in effect, personhood, then you can use the models we have for guardianship. They're already in place for minors, small children. We could use them for animals. But we have to have one animal that's given personhood. And that's what that project is about. So we're on the brink of a lot of stuff. And let's see, I talked about the past and the present. If you want to hear about the future, you'll have to come back next year. Or better yet, you make the future. You make the future. Make it a compassionate, caring future. You can do it. Okay, questions, comments, criticisms. Come on, I've never been this clear before. Yeah, Mike. Can we take the mic?
I guess the courts are breaking down the characterization of animals as property, and do you see that going forward in the future? And I'm sure you're familiar with the Oregon case.
Yes.
Came down about a month ago. Could you comment on that and tell people what that's all about? That's a very good case.
Why don't you do that? You're familiar.
I don't know. I'm not that familiar with it. It had to do with a search warrant, I believe, or the Oregon Supreme Court ruled that there's a fight over seizing some animals, and the property owner demanded his interest in the property of the animal, but the court recognized that the animals had their own interests in terms of being suffering, so forth, and the police could come and seize these animals for cruelty.
That's exactly so. I want to say Mike is an attorney who works on animal stuff, so he knows this stuff. But the case he's referring to had to do with the blood draw from an animal. And it was contested on the grounds that the animal's property, you're seizing my property without a warrant. And the court said, no, this is a little bit different kind of property with the animal's own interest. And this animal needs to find out, we need to find out for the benefit of this animal, what kind of substances were in this animal's body. So this is another way of chipping away at animals as property. We're not all the way there, but the fact that they said, no, this isn't like your television. We can't go in and look at your television or computer without a warrant, but we can for this animal's benefit, because this animal is a living being, so we're halfway there. Thank you for the question. Other questions? I saw hands. Yes, Brian.
Given the current...
I'll repeat the question after you say it, so go ahead.
Given the current status of animal protection, what do you see, or is there a place for direct action, like more undercover work and protests and things like that?
All right, the question was, what's the place for direct action these days? And there is a place, there's always going to be a place for direct action to push the boundaries, no matter where we are, if you know what direct action is. Let me define activism. I'm going to back up another step here. To me, activism is a two-step process. Step one is you're refusing to commit the cruelty yourself. You're not eating the animals. You're not going to the circus where the elephants are being mistreated. That's all great and essential. But part two is you've got to go out and do something about what other people are doing too. For me, to recognize somebody as an activist, it's more than the one step. It's two steps. You have to go out, write letters, go to the circus protests, come here, donate to a group. You want to do something beside simply not inflict the cruelty yourself, which I respect also. So the question again is, what's the place of activism? Undercover videos are our biggest tool. You can't do it without the undercover videos. I spoke about how PETA used them. We need them still. And this is the reason that the abusers are opposing them them so heartily with ag laws. They are afraid of undercover videos. And that's your direct action. We need those videos to show what's really going on behind these fences. And there's times for protests, the circus protests, which I go to let people know what's going on. Ringling Brothers is no longer going to use elephants. They didn't do it because people were just sitting at home. They did it because people were out there publicizing what they were doing. So there will always be a place for direct action to push the boundaries. But we also have to consolidate that which has already been pushed. And that's what I talked about with the humane economy. So it's all of this at once. Please.
So what I'm hearing is that the animal rights movement is directly correlated to like the feminist rights movement. And is there anything that you can speak to with that people can get involved with to help empower women to be responsible for their bodies and to make their own?
Oh yeah. The question was, what is the relationship between the animal rights movement and the feminist movement and the empowerment of women worldwide? A strong connection. Because I've been going to these conferences forever, and there's always representatives from the Feminists for Animal Rights. They've been there at the beginning, and what they stood up and said from the beginning is that we know how this feels, and we're going to apply this to animals. So this has been one of the strongest foundations of the animal rights movement, has been the feminist support for it. When feminism turns into a worldwide movement in favor of the empowerment of women around reproductive rights, the animals are going to benefit tremendously because of the overpopulation issue, but also because traditionally women have made more compassionate choices. I'm not going to try to hide that. That's the case. And I think that that is something that we as men need to speak to. Why have we made such macho choices all these years? I don't know why. I spent my life not doing that. And when I see myself doing that, telling myself don't do it anymore. So there's always going to be that linkage.
Are there any recommendations or accesses that you can provide for feminists? Because you said some other ways that we can be active. Are there things that are there effective forms of activism for feminism or any kind of groups or anything that you can recommend?
Contact Feminists for Animal Rights, Carol Adams. They have an entire list of things that can be approached from a feminist perspective in terms of mistreatment, in terms of kindness, in terms of feminist-led organizations also acting as conduits for a humane economy. And if you go into these mutual funds, you'll see that there's a large joining of those two things. The mutual funds, many of them will say, these are organizations that promote women to the top, break the glass ceiling. And those are also the organizations that have the humane economy and buy in earlier to a humane economy. So yes.
Okay, what did you say her name was? Carol what?
Carol Adams, Feminists for Animal Rights. Great link. Yes, please.
Well, first, thank you for all the work that you've done. And all critters deserve committed people. So, I'm a wildlife rehabilitator, and we in Colorado, the state law says that wild animals are the property of the state.
Yes.
And the Division of Wildlife, therefore, owns them.
Yes.
Any suggestions on how to change this?
Yes.
Because Division of Wildlife's pretty awesome.
All right. The question was Parks and Wildlife. There's a Parks and Wildlife Department, and it's pretty Stone Age, actually. They have a commission, and the commission has 11 members. Of the 11 members of that commission, 6 are by law hunters and ranchers. So on every single vote that comes up, no matter how reasonable, you're going to get outvoted. So that would be my first recommendation. Change the constituencies that make up the commission. That used to be perhaps representative of Colorado demographics. I don't think it ever was. But to have a majority on that commission that's hunters and ranchers, that's the first thing that I would suggest, if you want to go after that. The bigger issue, of course, has to do with the respect for species and listing endangered species. I just went to a hearing that addressed the very issue of mountain lions. They want to kill all these mountain lions. Over 300 mountain lions a year are killed in Colorado. 300 a year. And they say, well, sustainable population. Well, it isn't. And as long as you've got the majority of the commission that feels that way, they're going to say, well, that's sustainable. Sustainable for us, maybe, because we don't want them killing a single one of our cattle. So a lot of it has to do with putting a lot of species on the endangered species list, listing them either as threatened or endangered, and then they can't touch them. The state can't touch them. So that's another thing we can do. And last, but certainly not least, is animals as property. Until we get through that hump, it's going to be a long road. Other questions? Yes?
How do we get prairie dogs delisted as agricultural pests?
The question is, how do we get prairie dogs delisted as agricultural pests? And the answer is, I don't know. I wish I knew. You should have helped me on that one.
We're killing thousands
I know.
on the Front Range alone.
Prairie Dog Rescue. Work with them, another great group. I love them. What else? Yes, what else?
That animal activists can now be prosecuted as domestic terrorists.
Yes.
In some cases, can you speak to that?
Do I have to? The question was, animal activists can now be prosecuted as domestic terrorists, and that's correct. Animal Enterprise Terrorist Act allows those who engage in concerted action to disrupt the activities of a legal corporate proceeding and endeavor can be prosecuted as terrorists. And this was directed specifically at environmental and animal rights people because they mentioned the animal rights codes in there. See, because what happened before is they had WICO. I don't know if you know what WICO was, but before this came into being, they had WICO, and it was hard to prove. WICO was hard to prove. So they tried to get a few people on the WICO, failed every time. So they passed what was called the Animal Enterprise Protection Act in the 90s, and they felt that was too weak, and they came back under the Bush administration and upgraded this to the Animal Enterprise Terrorist Act, and I think it was 05, 06. And that's what they're prosecuting a lot of people under that. They got the shack people. I think they should still have the shack people under the old Protection Act. But what they've done is they've made people afraid to go out and speak out. Because if you speak out against these groups and somebody else acts against these groups, they might say you're part of a conspiracy. You would come under this statute. So people have to be very careful what they say. They don't have to be, but they tend to be if they're intimidated. And our job is not to be intimidated. Speak out anyway. And that's the use of that. And it's only been used 1 or 2 times. But they will use it, and it hangs over the head of people. And this ties into the grand jury thing I was talking about. They try to get you up in front of a grand jury and testify your friends. What did you see at the demonstration? Who did you see? What did they say? And they give you immunity. The way this works in the grand jury is you're called up, you don't want to testify, and you say, okay, I'm not going to testify. And I take the Fifth Amendment. So what they do then is they say, okay, we give you immunity so that you can't be prosecuted based on what you say. But guess what? The person next to you will be prosecuted on what you say, and you'll be prosecuted on the basis of what they say, and you'll both be prosecuted under the AETA. So the grand jury is a witch hunt, and these are another tools to intimidate people. So don't be intimidated. Just go live your life. And the people I represented did that. And I can tell you that 90% of them, I'm glad they did what they did. And some of them went to jail, and some even went to prison. And I would stand up there and talk for them. And they wanted me to tell the jury why they did what they did. Tell them how it felt on Thanksgiving. When you sat around, there's a dead bird with feet sticking out. And it felt to us like there was a cat. You might as well have a cat on the table with their feet sticking out. They wanted me to talk to the jury about that. These were brave people, and they are brave people, and there's going to be a room for activism, and that's not going to scare us. Thank you.